All right, we're live on Facebook.
Thank you. Greetings from Lexington, Kentucky, and thanks for joining us today for our ACYPL virtual town hall. I am Maggie Mix, Chief Advancement Officer for the Council of State Governments, known to many as CSG. Our organization was founded by the states in 1933 and serves state officials from all three branches of government through public policy and leadership development programs, as well as direct technical assistance to the states and U.S. territories. I am a proud alumna and board trustee for ACYPL. Thank you for your participation and involvement with ACYPL over the years. As an organization that brings together young political leaders to find common ground and understanding and share varied perspectives, our mission has never been more needed or important than today. We want today's town hall to be conversational, and I hope informal. If you have a question, feel free to submit it to the chat down here or the Q&A box. I'm going to monitor it throughout the conversation and bring you into the conversation as we can. If you're having technical difficulties of any kind, again, just tap into the chat box and a member of the ACYPL team will assist you. Now, as states lead during COVID-19, countless societal trends and public policy considerations have emerged. To govern during the pandemic, state legislatures have been forced to make capital investments in their technologies to allow remote committee hearings and voting. Beyond these technology enhancements, the challenges of how to lead and govern during multiple crises has brought on by the pandemic have provided state leaders much to ponder. This town hall will explore how state legislatures have responded to the challenges presented by the pandemic and provide insights from elected leaders from across the country on public policy trends that they foresee in the coming months and years ahead. Today, we will seek to answer the question, how has COVID-19 immediately and potentially forever modernize state legislatures? Now, to help us answer that question, we have brought together an impressive group of ACYPL alumni, both Republicans and Democrats in true ACYPL spirit, who serve in state legislatures from around the country. Now, let me introduce you to them now. Florida State Senator Ana Cherie Flores, a Republican, has served in the legislature for the past 16 years and is finishing her final term in the state Senate this year. She represents southern Miami-Dade and the Florida Keys. During her long tenure in the legislature and in her time as part of Senate leadership, she has been heralded as a champion for education for Florida's diverse communities, constituencies, and families. Texas State Representative Ana Hernandez, a Democrat, represents parts of our nation's fourth largest city, Houston. She was born on the US-Mexico border and in Mexico. A leader on immigration reform, she was elected to the Texas House of Representatives at age 27 in 2005. Ana is an attorney and serves as the vice chair of the House Committee on State Affairs. The committee's jurisdiction covers a broad range of issues, including conduct of elections, protections of constitutional freedoms, oversight of public pension systems, and operation of state and local government, all issues presenting themselves during COVID-19. Utah State Senator Derek Kitchen, a Democrat, represents his hometown of Salt Lake City. He has served in the Senate since 2019 after 2 terms on the Salt Lake City City Council. A small business owner and restaurateur, I look forward to hearing his reflections on impacts to small business brought on by COVID-19, but also how private sector innovation and modernization has led to some inspiring moments even during this time. Pennsylvania State Representative Ryan Mckenzie, a Republican, is the 9th generation to live in his hometown and represents the suburbs of Allentown. Representative Mckenzie currently serves as Deputy Majority Whip and Vice Chairman of the Labor and Industry Committee. Prior to his election to the House, he served as the Director of Policy for the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry. In his senior management role, he worked on issues relating to unemployment compensation reform, an issue of priority focus during this time. Welcome to you all, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So if we're trying to set the context of modernization and how COVID-19 has led to that question and those considerations, let's go back a little bit. So we are standing in March 13th. I think we've all agreed that that's kind of when the world shut down. And where were you standing? What were you doing? And how did your state legislatures immediately pivot, the word of 2020, their operations in light of the pandemic that had arrived? Senator Flores, let's start with you.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. So March 13th was actually the last day of our 2020 session. So it was very much, it was like this weird kind of day that, you know, we were still in Tallahassee and kind of getting, you know, phone calls and conversations from home, from our schools, you know, from those of us that have kids in school saying, hey, kids are going home today and I don't know when they're coming back. So it was, and that is at the backdrop of the typical chaos that is the last day of the legislative session, where everyone's trying to, you know, kind of get everything done at the same time. As you mentioned, it's my last regular session. So we have to pack up our office and we just left. So I actually need to still go back to Tallahassee at some point before November and pack up our office. So it was an interesting moment, being that it was the last day of session, because it was very much, like you said, like the day when the world just stopped. And at the time we all thought it was just going to be for a couple weeks, and you know, several months later, obviously we're still dealing with this.
So they departed and you haven't had any special sessions. So no immediate.
In fact, well, so our last day of session was the 13th. Not really our last day. So we have to vote on the budget is your last action. And you need 3 days from the day that the budget's printed to the day that you vote. So our budget didn't actually get printed and finalized till that Friday morning. So we had to come back 3 days later to take the vote. At that point, the vote is, you know, you already know what's going to happen. There's just kind of this constitutional cooling off period. What did happen for those of us like myself, that to get to Tallahassee, generally we fly because it's so far from South Florida. I don't think any of the South Florida legislators actually went to Tallahassee to vote. So in a very strange way, my last very official act as a state senator, I didn't, like I said, I didn't pass that last vote because there was just so much fear and uncertainty surrounding, you know, getting in and going to an airport, getting on a plane, you know, do we touch things, do we not? I mean, it just was bizarre. So what ended up being the very last day of session was, which normally is, you know, fun, in a relative term, I guess, fun. But, you know, people are at least relieved it's the last day. This was a very somber, quiet tone. I watched it from home and it was quiet, was I think the thing that resounded most to us, is that it was just so quiet. You could hear a pin drop, not just in the Senate, but in the House, you know, with 120 members, there's usually a lot of chatter, and it was just quiet. Because I think a lot of people were, you know, we're still very scared.
Representative Hernandez, what was happening in Texas? Can you hear me, Representative Hernandez?
She had some technical difficulties.
Yeah, I think that hurricane's impacting. Representative Mckenzie, what was happening in Pennsylvania? How did you all respond?
Yeah, so we here in Pennsylvania have a full-time legislature. And so after March 13th, we actually did go back in session very quickly, just a few days later. And as was mentioned by the senator, there was, you know, a lot of unknown concerns, and everybody was a bit afraid of what was going on with the virus at the time. So we immediately went back in, but we only went back for one vote, and that was just to allow for remote voting. And so we very quickly transitioned to electronic voting, where people could vote from their home districts. At the same time, it was something that was new to the legislature. And so there was a lot of concern about how that would operate, what types of bills would be run. And so we actually, at the time, passed a rule unanimously with support from both Democrat and Republican leaders that said you could only vote remotely on legislation which was non-controversial. And by that meaning both the Republican and Democrat leaders in the chamber agreed to call up that legislation, whereas typically it would just be the majority leader that would call up a piece of legislation. So that was a phased transition that we went through to allow for remote voting to initially occur and make sure that people were comfortable with that. We went to that process. And everybody was there for that initial remote voting transition. Then everybody largely went to voting from home. And now it's kind of in a hybrid state where some people still do vote from home if they have a concern. Maybe they have a family member who is immunocompromised or has some kind of issues, or maybe they have concerns about their own exposure, so they can vote remotely, and some people still do that. But largely, the legislature has returned to in-person voting at this point. Now, at the same time, some of the benefits that we have seen from that transition about remote voting and remote hearings are continuing, and people are actually enjoying them. So you're seeing a lot more remote hearings taking place, and I think that that's something that's probably going to continue as we move forward as well.
All right, Representative Hernandez, can you hear me now?
I'm back. I apologize.
No, you're fine. Where were you standing on March 13th?
Well, our legislature in Texas only meets every 2 years. So it was during our interim. So we're all back in our districts on March 13th. We are preparing for our next session that will start in January of 2021. So we're looking at other states and see what has worked and what has not worked and try to follow some of that as we convene in January.
Nice. All right, Senator Kitchen, where were you in March?
Well, I appreciate the question. Like Senator Flores, we were in our final day of our general session. And here in Utah, we are a part-time legislature. So we meet for 45 days once a year. It runs from January through mid-March. And I remember the day before the last day of our session is when the travel ban from Europe was announced by the federal government and the Trump administration. And that was, I think, when it really hit a lot of the legislators here in Utah that this was something really serious that we needed to prepare for. And so with less than 24 hours before the end of our the statutory end of our legislative session, we scrambled together some policy to anticipate what might come our way with this pandemic. And so we passed a joint resolution that allowed for lawmakers to convene virtually. And again, that allowed us to conduct all of our meetings virtually as necessary, and it gave us a lot of latitude and exactly what that looked like. Since our session ended at midnight on the 13th of March, we have since had 4 special sessions. And in that vein, we have the first 2 sessions were primarily electronic. So we use a platform from Cisco called WebEx to meet. And then our IT department actually crafted together a separate voting system. So we use WebEx for the visual component of the meeting. And then we have a secure site where we cast all of our votes formally. Now I say that we've had 4 special sessions since the end of our general session, because that's the most of any part-time legislative body in the United States. And so the first session itself was called just 1 month after we finalized our general session. And we had a lot of policy matters to address. Obviously, the impact of COVID-19 and the global pandemic created colossal impacts for the state of Utah. And so we crafted all kinds of bills that were really critical to us navigating our way out of the pandemic itself and the ensuing economic issues that followed. So, things like changing our tax deadlines, giving our governor and the executive branch various emergency powers and things of that nature. But, we've moved really fast in the state of Utah. We have 29 members in the Utah State Senate and a total of 75 members in the House. And we have been lockstep on all of these emergency changes as we adapt to COVID. Now, the most recent 2 special sessions, we have conducted them in a hybrid model. where we have about half of the legislature in person at the Capitol, and then the rest of them meeting remotely from their home districts. Utah is, we have a lot of rural legislators, and so I have found that a lot of these legislators from the other corners of the state have really enjoyed meeting virtually. They save a lot of the gas money, and it's nice for them to be able to meet in person, or excuse me, digitally. But it comes with its fair share of challenges as well, because in politics, a great deal of our policy making happens in conversation that we have sort of randomly in the hallway. And so what I have found is that a lot of these discussions aren't taking place. And so there's a bit of distance between certain members of the legislature that are meeting in person and those that are piping in digitally. So it's come with its fair share of challenges, but I would say after the first special session back in April, we have been able to adjust quite well, and it's been very enjoyable for me personally.
Well, and I think that's actually a great bridge, because one of the issues that you all amended, but that you've actually had for a really long time, were issues around mail-in voting and remote voting and that sort of thing. We now find ourselves in the height of election season. A number of primaries have taken place. We're now gearing up for the general. The conventions have now shut down and been executed by virtually. In terms of the campaign season that we currently exist in, what changes did you all see in Utah on your mail-in voting? And then from our other panelists, how are your states approaching how to vote remotely and approaching it individually?
Sure, yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So as you may know, there are 5 states that currently conduct elections entirely by mail, including Utah. And what this means is that if you're a registered voter, that you don't have to request a mail-in ballot or an absentee ballot. The state and the county clerks automatically send them out to all registered voters. Here in Utah, we've had a vote by mail for years. In fact, back in 2012, the legislature authorized an elections officer to administer the election entirely by mail. And in the following years, we've seen some really interesting results. So in 2016, the last presidential election, we had 21 out of our 29 counties conduct vote by mail entirely. That same year, the presidential year, we found that in these counties that did conduct vote by mail, we saw a 6 to 7% increase in voter turnout. So that was great. Some further details that I think are worth mentioning here is that those counties that did go to vote by mail saw the greatest number of increases among low propensity voters, which I think is excellent. Also in that same year, our statewide voter turnout was more than 80% of registered voters. And so we're really proud of that voter engagement level and hope to see that increase in the 2020 cycle. Now, here in Utah, we had a statewide primary back in June for the Republican primary. And this again was one of the largest turnouts that we've ever seen in a primary in state history. And this one was conducted entirely by mail in all 29 counties. And so as we go into the general election this November, we've already had a dry run on the vote by mail statewide. And that was without many hiccups. That was, it was a pretty smooth process generally. But I will say just really quickly while I've got the floor, in our special sessions over the last few months, we have crafted a number of policies relating to COVID-19 and our elections. 2 of them in particular are designed to make sure that voters have the ability to safely engage in the election in November. The first one, which was back in April, it allowed us to do the primary entirely by mail, and we also increased a ton of funding for our counties so that election employees as well as voters were safe and had enough personal protective equipment. And then we also created a process during that same time that allowed for a mobile voting for each county to have unique rules for their for mobile voting. That means drive-through voting, various outdoor voting booths. So we have some city and county parks that are preparing to take voters so that people can conduct their or cast their ballot, excuse me, either through the mail, as I already mentioned, but also if for some reason they don't trust the USPS system, or they changed their affiliation, or something changed on their address, they can actually go vote in person as well. And so we're allowing folks to do that with outdoor voting, which is going to be a bit of a challenge because here in Utah we have pretty intense winters, and the election in November on the 3rd is who knows what the weather's going to be like. But the second thing, which is worth mentioning really quickly, and just last week we had a special session, we passed a bill that basically gives the county clerk the ability to accept a ballot outside of the county clerk's office. So we're doing all kinds of things: walk-up voting, drive-through voting, we're just trying to be as I guess creative as possible as we anticipate.
Or modern.
Modern, yeah, contemporary, right? I mean, at the end of the day, this is about democracy and voter engagement. And so if we can raise our voter engagement from 80.2% to 85 or 90%, that would be ideal. So yeah, I mean, we're again, sort of like Representative Hernandez, we are watching what other states are doing, but that's not stopping us from trying to do our own innovative work here.
And I know that Florida has actually had mail-in voting for quite some time as well. Anything to add to kind of those insights?
Yeah, well, I mean, as we have for the last 10 years, I'd say we've done a lot. We don't do universal mail-in voting like they do in Utah, but it's anyone that wants to be able to vote by mail can vote by mail, right? Mm-hmm. Prior to 10 years ago, you'd have to give an excuse or something. So one on vote by mail, it's something that we've done for a while, and I'd point out two things to states that are looking at what works and what doesn't. So the two biggest issues I'd say that we have that come up with critics of vote by mail are, number one is that your ballot has to be in the election supervisor's possession by the time that the polls close on election night. So the challenge that exists there is, people get concerned, with the postal service. Is it going to take too long? Does it not take too long? And so there's been a lot of pushback for the last couple of years, but it's intensified now to extend that deadline and say, well, if you're postmarked by 7 p.m., then it should be fine. That's a policy discussion that will have lots of, we'll have political ramifications as to how it is that one makes that decision. But it's, I would say it's been beneficial in a way to be able to point to the law that hasn't been, it's been consistent for some time and said, look, it's very clear. You need to have your ballot in by 7 p.m. on election night. Your state can make a different rule, but I guess my suggestion would be is, you have a rule and you kind of stick to it, right? So some of the things that we did just our dry run was in August 18th was our statewide primary. And one of the things that we did for our, that is we had at all of our early voting locations, we also have very extensive early voting. It lasts for 2 weeks prior. All of our early voting locations had election officials there with like an official ballot drop-off box, right? So if you don't know that your ballot's not going to get there on time, you could go into an early voting site and you just, hands-free kind of, you don't have to go in, you just go in and drop it off. And also on election day, you can go into your elections supervisor, elections department. So first concern is you got to figure out what's the day that the ballot is due, and then and stick to it, right? You'll have critics, but stick to it.
I actually think that is really, really important to note that in Florida, it is the same day, it is election day. considering that you all are one of the states that is always kind of the big question on election night, that actually in a presidential election year is really important, that the decision of the presidential election and other Florida elections could be determined that night, depending on which way Florida goes. I just think that that's fascinating.
We forget this, our last November election, but in November 2018, if anyone recalls, we had, you know, elections for governor and for all of our cabinet members, and they were razor thin margins.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a lot of people's questioning, hey, my ballot got there at 7:10 or got there the next day. And so, you know, the only way to change that would be through legislation. But I guess what I'd say is that we're trying to make it easier to make sure that the ballot actually does make it on time.
Mm-hmm.
We mail it out early. And then I think having those drop boxes, that helped cure a lot of the challenges when you look at the number of ballots that had been rejected because they got there late. And then the second issue, and this one's probably even harder, is, you know, the signature on your absentee ballot or mail-in ballot has to match the signature that's on file. And it's kind of been more of a public service announcement to make sure to let voters know, if you think that your signature has changed, you've got to go in and change it. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that we've done, I would say, again, I think to help ease concerns is, you know, as long as your ballot gets there with enough time, you can track your ballot. So all of our mail-in ballots actually have like a UPS tracking number. So you can go online yourself and find out, you know, when it's in, when it got there, is there a deficiency? And I know that, you know, a lot of the election supervisors, you know, they try and make an effort, as long as they have the time, to be able to call and contact the voters to let them know about that deficiency.
Mm-hmm. In Texas, what's the status on your mail-in voting? Oh, I think you're on mute, Representative Hernandez.
Sorry. Very different in Texas. You have to meet certain eligibility requirements to be able to vote by mail. And that's either over the age of 65, or that you'll be out of the county on election day, or cite some disability or illness, or if you're confined in jail but still eligible to vote. And our Democratic Party leaders and others had filed suit to try to expand those requirements to include the current pandemic, and say if someone is fearful of going to the voting location because of exposure to coronavirus, that they would be able to vote by mail. Well, that was litigated in the courts, and they prevailed at the lower court, but then it was blocked on appeal. And so now our county clerks are kind of taking matters into their own hands and mailing ballot applications. Can you hear me? Am I frozen again?
No.
Okay.
You're good.
Sorry. I know I have a bad internet connection today. I apologize. So
it's a hurricane.
So for our July runoff election, our county clerk sent out the mail ballot applications for all those voters that are 65 and older, and announced earlier this week that it was their intent to mail an application to all registered voters in Harris County, which is over 2 million registered voters. And just got a letter from our Secretary of State yesterday asking them to halt any plans to do that, because that would be abuse of voter rights. And they are still in discussion about that. So we're trying different ways to make sure that people that want to vote are able to vote, whether that is in person or not. Unfortunately, we have very strict laws on mail-in ballots, but there is no state law that prohibits our county clerks from mailing those applications for a mail-in ballot, whether you're eligible or not. And so it's still kind of in limbo right now, as you know, we near the November election.
Got it. And I know Pennsylvania is actually currently legislating around this issue. Representative Mckenzie, you want to share kind of an update on what's happening in Harrisburg?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I always feel like elections and voting is one of these interesting topics where there is a state-federal dynamic. So we're all dealing with federal elections coming up, yet at the same time, most of the ground rules are laid out at the state level. And so we've heard this whole spectrum of options available, from full mail voting to rather, only with excuse voting in Texas. And so here in Pennsylvania, we're making a transition as well. Last year, we did authorize no excuse vote by mail. And so that is a new element that's come into effect this year in Pennsylvania. And for the first time, that occurred in our primary, which we actually delayed from April, and we moved the primary back to June 2nd. Because of coronavirus and COVID-19, there has been a much greater adoption of vote by mail than I think anybody expected. And so now we're wrestling with how you handle that huge influx of mail votes, in addition to allowing for the option to vote in person on election day. So people have those two options in place. And so we are going back in session next week to actually address this issue and try to sort out some of the kinks from the primary. And so really it falls into three buckets, the issues that we're dealing with. The first is around deadlines, which the senator from Florida talked about. Is the deadline in the office by election day, which is how it stands in the law now, or should there be some other deadline, a postmark, et cetera? You know, that gets tricky though, because again, we do want the results as quickly to election night as possible. And at the same time, the governor here has allowed for stamped envelopes to be mailed out for the ballots. But oftentimes, at least in our system, the Federal Postal Service here in Pennsylvania, they don't affix a postmark to pre-stamped mail. And so that's created a problem where you say, well, you can't maybe have that. You do maybe have to stick to the deadline of election day. So that's something that's going to be coming up next week in the legislative session. The second item is around pre-canvassing, or what we call pre-canvassing. So sorting of the ballots before they get counted on election day. How do you allow that to occur, and what time frame does that occur before the election, so that again, as much of that work of opening up a return envelope, opening up a ballot envelope, unfolding the ballots, flattening them out, scanning them through, and then leading up to the final step of tabulation. That's when you have tens of thousands of ballots in counties, obviously that can take a long time. And so there's discussion around how soon we want to allow for that to occur before election day, some of that pre-canvassing work, so that again, you can have a result as close to election night as possible. And the third and final kind of big area, which was already discussed, is around drop-off locations, drop boxes, or other sites that allow and accept ballots. And so right now it's only that you can send it through the mail back to the county voter registration office, or you can drop it off in person at that office. Some groups are playing with the ideas of different drop boxes and how that works. And so again, there are concerns around chain of custody, just who's monitoring drop boxes. We don't allow for ballot harvesting here in Pennsylvania, so an individual has to return it in the mail or in person. And so we want to try to maintain the integrity of that process. But we do want to expand options. So right now, the things that we're discussing are some of the other options that people have talked about, where you could allow for, let's say, election day, to allow polling places to collect all of those mail ballots. And so that would alleviate the burden of waiting in line. A lot of people and polling places in Pennsylvania do have lines on election day, and they can be quite long. So this would alleviate that. You could still drop it off in your neighborhood or in your community, but you would basically just pull up, drop it off, and you could go. So you wouldn't have to wait for an hour or something in line. So those are kind of the three main policy areas that we're dealing with. But at the same time, we're under a pretty tight deadline of getting it done as we get ready for the November election. So again, that's actually going to be taking place next week here in Pennsylvania, where we go back in session to discuss and try to iron out some of those policy decisions.
Wow. Short runway for big issues.
That's for sure.
Okay, so you all are elected and you all have mastered campaigning. How do you campaign in a pandemic? What's the biggest change that you've seen either personally or amongst your peers? I know Senator Flores is unfortunately terming out, but raising money, door knocking, communicating, breaking through the clutter of a pandemic. Each of you, maybe the one thing that you've learned as a candidate or an elected official during COVID. Senator Kitchen, you want to lead us off?
Sure. So I'm lucky that I'm not up for re-election this year, so I get to support all my favorite candidates and various ballot initiatives around the state. but you're right, you know, campaigning is a completely different animal in the 2020 cycle with COVID. And, you know, there's a lot of interest among the general public on politics right now, naturally. But you know, the traditional ways of engaging are off the table. You can't really knock on doors. You can't hold big rallies. So we've had to be really creative with the way that we engage. Social media is something that you cannot get away from. And so really well-produced content on social media is definitely something I've been encouraging all of my fellow candidates to put a lot of their time and resources into. But, you know, nothing beats the phone. Just picking up the telephone and calling your voters, getting your voter list, engaging with donors. You know, while we are in the middle of a really historic economic crisis, frankly, there are still people in our community that have resources and are interested in, you know, putting dollars and cents behind causes that matter to them. And so, you know, I've been encouraging candidates to continue to fundraise and to do their best to communicate it. You know, a campaign comes down to comms, and so the better that you can be at, you know, communicating your values and what you intend to do, the better. So it's a different world, but it's not impossible. Just a little impersonal.
Yeah. Representative Mckenzie, I know you're on the ballot come November. What are you learning as you go?
Yeah, so, you know, I feel like it's not too dissimilar from lots of other walks of life, you know, whether it be returning to schools or businesses, or like I mentioned in state government and voting. There basically has been a transition, and nobody is going back to doing things totally normal and the way that they used to be done. So really, if you have option A is normal, option B is hybrid, and option 3 is totally virtual, basically people are choosing from those last two options. So it's, are you doing some kind of hybrid or a totally virtual campaign? And I think that's kind of the fundamental decision that campaigns are making here first. Which of those options are you going to go to? And then once you do those, your different ways to communicate and talk to voters kind of fall into different buckets. So, you know, you do see hybrid models emerging where there are socially distanced events where people are outside and wearing masks, and even doing, you know, some doors and other activities that way in a safe and responsible way. So you see some of that is returning in certain parts of the state, in certain areas, in certain campaigns. And then other campaigns are choosing to just go the totally virtual route. And so you'll see in those models a lot more of at-home phone banking or Facebook live events like this, et cetera. So you see, again, I think you have to start with that fundamental decision, and then within that, you have your options kind of laid out of which direction you want to go. And so that's kind of where it's at in Pennsylvania, and I think that's going to continue for at least this election season and maybe more.
Representative Hernandez, what are you seeing on the trail?
Thankfully, I am on the ballot, but I'm unopposed. But I have attended multiple Zoom fundraising events for colleagues and for other candidates locally. It seems like everyone's having a Zoom fundraiser, so you kind of need to, you know, something catchy to get people's attention. So I've seen celebrities, you know, actors, you know, singers that have been the special guests to kind of, you know, as a hook to get more people engaged in Zoom fundraisers and town halls. And in Texas, the weather's been nice, and so we try to do as many outdoor events as we can, you know, being socially distant, having food drive or a mass drive or a back to school backpack distribution. We actually partnering with some of our local officials tomorrow to have one in Houston. So having outdoor events to, you know, still be engaged in the community, but in a safe way that we're socially distant.
Nice. And for our term limited friend,
Well, hey, it's a
trends.
great time to not be on the ballot. Just kidding. So we had, as I mentioned, in August, so just two weeks ago, a big primary, and mostly for state legislative offices. You know, I had a lot of friends that were on the ballot, and they did a little bit of kind of what everyone here is talking about. One of the things that I was very encouraged to see is a lot of focus on responding to the needs of the community. So, you know, we've had, you know, initial crisis, you know, with our unemployment system, as I'm sure happened in other states, but in Florida was, you know, particularly hard and crashed and the system. And so, you know, we had folks at the beginning that were, you know, making sure that, that they had the unemployment application easy to get to spots. You know, a lot of people need food. So there's been a lot of partnerships with food distributions, with some of our, you know, with local food banks type of things. And it's here we are 5 months into the pandemic, and there are still hundreds of people showing up every single day to food distributions in areas of my district that are being spearheaded by different elected officials or people that are seeking office. The same thing goes for mask distribution. So again, I mean, kind of doing the things that we have always done, but modifying it in a way that we can respond to people's immediate needs and having to be sensitive, right? Because, you know, it's a tough time for everybody. It is a tough time, particularly for those that have financial challenges. So there are financial challenges, there are food challenges, there's work-life challenges, there's mental health challenges. And so I think coming up with creative ways to still ask voters for support, but the difference is, and I think this is a little bit to Senator Kitchen's point, is that I find that the electorate is much more engaged. They ask the questions and they want their candidates, and they certainly want the incumbents to answer the question, okay, well, look, COVID's gonna be around for forever, right? How are we going to live with this? This is not the 2-week crisis that we thought it was. How are we going to deal with fixing major problems that we have with our unemployment system? To give an example, in Florida, and it's something quite frankly that we knew was always a problem, but we didn't really have to deal with it. And now we have to really deal with it. And so it's, you know, I found that certainly people are still campaigning. We still have a lot of people knocking doors. It's, you know, socially distant, they stand away and giving out masks. But, you know, people, when they're knocking on the door and they're asking questions, they're asking the tough questions and they're expecting people to have their, you know, to have an answer.
Real answers.
The right answer.
So what I'm hearing is personal outreach. The phone is still your friend. Technology and the hook on Zoom. And the third was Representative Mckenzie's just safety, but the hybrid model, maybe the shuffle to election day is kind of the 3 themes I'm hearing from how to get through to November. Okay, so we get through November and we're standing in January. And I know all of your legislative sessions start at different marks in a year, but just assuming that the start of the year is when all of the states come back together and legislatures are back in the capitals. I guess it's a 2-part question. One, how do we, to your point, Senator Kitchen, have public input and healthy legislative processes and dialogue so that our solutions are inclusive of voices, stakeholders, industry, I mean, all the folks that gather in the Capitol physically, typically. What does it physically look like in January? How do you take those inputs? How do your offices interact with the myriad of voices impacting legislative considerations? And also, what are you championing? What are the policy trends that will emerge out of this time? So I guess I'll go back to Texas first. What does it look like after your 2-year hiatus? I know you guys are.
Well, we're still working on it. We got a survey about a month ago, and the results just came out for all of the members, both in the House and the Senate, to kind of give their input on what they would like the legislative session to look like in terms of safety protocols. Like I mentioned, we only meet every other year. So this is our interim period where we normally have interim committee hearings, but those haven't taken place either at the Capitol or remotely. Our Capitol is still closed. And so we're considering different things. We don't have a plan in place yet, whether we'll have remote sessions or, as mentioned by some of the other legislatures, having a hybrid session, whether we're going to allow people into our office or not. You know, as you know, everything's bigger in Texas. And I know it had been mentioned earlier about having space. Well, there's definitely space at the Capitol, but whether or not we want just the people that work there, that need to be there, that need to testify, whether we want any visitors on the House floor, whether all 150 of us, because there are 150 state representatives in Texas. If all 150 plus the essential staff are going to be in one chamber, or how we're going to do that. So it's still in the works. And knowing we have a couple of months before session starts. So we're, like I said, looking at other legislatures and see what has worked for them.
And before I turn, what policy considerations do you think will just emerge from this pandemic from your perspective?
I know we're going to talk a little later about healthcare, but I think the expansion of Medicaid, I think, is more important than ever. Texas is only one of 12 states that has not expanded Medicaid, and we've seen what impact that's had, the disparate impact it's had in our communities, and then education as well. I mean, there's been a lot of confusion as schools were getting ready to go back to school, whether or not they would lose funding for not having in-class instruction. And so I think those are two very important issues as we continue to move forward, with COVID.
Mm-hmm. What does it look like in Utah in January?
That's a good question. We've obviously done this hybrid model the last couple of special sessions. I'm expecting another special session in October. With COVID, we just don't know. I mean, it's a day by day, week by week kind of situation. But we are starting to contemplate what a general session in January may look like. No formal action has yet been taken. However, the Capitol is still closed to the general public. So even when we're meeting in this hybrid model, whether it's our committee meeting or actual formal votes on the floor, we're not seeing lobbyists. We're not seeing the general public available in person. On our committee meetings, we have begun to do we have a digital platform for constituent engagement and public comment, it's great to be able to continue to solicit that kind of feedback from the general public, but it's way less effective than somebody coming to a committee meeting in person and providing that kind of feedback. And so I hope, just for the sake of being responsive to the general public, that we're able to bring people back in, even if we have to schedule them or figure out a way to get them and their face sort of piped in digitally in some way. But again, it's to be determined. The press is another important piece of meeting in person, and how do we allow the press to come and be safe and not bring public health issues with them. And so we've begun allowing various members of the press, photographers, certain reporters into the Capitol during these hybrid sessions, things like temperature checks, obviously masks. We've been partitioning certain areas off so that various members of the press have their own little box to stay within. We're trying to be as creative as possible, but it's definitely an imperfect set of solutions that we're playing around with right now. So I'll be sure to communicate with this group here as we approach our general session, just with what we're thinking, and I'd love to hear feedback from others as well along the way.
Senator Flores, I know that you won't be there in January in your current capacity, but I know that you and I were talking about it before this call, that Florida's a mega state, but your state capital was not built in mega state size. I mean, your physical structures, you've got the mirrors, or you're turning the corner, and you've got an onslaught of people always in your capital in Tallahassee. Any indications on how that will be safe and still open for access?
Yeah, well, I think that we're all dealing with the same things that everybody else is. But here's where my hope comes in, is that we now know that COVID will be around in one way or another for a very long time. And until there is a widespread vaccine, everything from football games to my kid's 8-year-old's birthday party, and everything in between, you have to rethink how you're going to do it. So here's what my hope is that we don't waste the next kind of 3 or 4 months before session happens, like and I don't want to say we wasted the first couple of months of the crisis, because we just know it was going to last this long, but now we know it's something that's for a while. So I think that there will be enough data points available that we've collected through, we see when the spikes happen, right? Spikes happened after Memorial Day, after 4th of July. Schools are starting here. Are we going to start to see a spike happen after 4th of July, after school starting? And if we do, is that spike less than the one that we saw, say, after 4th of July, because our schools opened in a more responsible way, right? So what I mean to say by all that is, look, we have enough time between now and January to figure out, okay, what are some of the things that we know will work, right? We know that having a temperature check, that's going to work. We know that having your hand sanitizing station every set couple of feet will work. I'll give you an interesting Florida anecdote, right? So everyone goes to Disney World, and people are so, when you go to Disney World, one of the things you're always excited about, it's just so clean, right? I mean, how do they keep Disney World so clean with so many people there? This is pre-corona. And that's because experts from, that hired by Disney figured out if you put a garbage can every X number of feet, I think the number is 10, people will throw their garbage out, right? If you put it 12 feet, they're not, and they're gonna throw it on the floor. My point is, if we can put, a hand sanitizing station every 4 or 5 feet, people are gonna use it. If you figure out how you make your committee hearing time last longer so that people can come in and be scheduled. We're dealing with this, like I said, with schools now. My kids they're starting virtually right now. Hopefully they'll be in person soon. And when they are in person, they were figuring out ways that only part of the kids are in school one day, and the next day there's another cohort. And maybe we'll do it 1 week on and 1 week off. And they'll still be getting taught virtually on the off time. Point is, look, where there's a will, there's a way. And the most important thing, and this is a very ACYPL type statement, if we don't worry about whose idea was, right? If it was a Republican idea or whoever it was, if we just worry about like, hey, we want to be safe, then we can actually do this, and we can govern, and we can have people come in and speak, because that's something that's absolutely crucial. Having that vibe of 15 people coming in and all of a sudden speak against or for a bill maybe we thought wasn't going to be controversial, but now of the unintended consequences because someone came in and talked to us. I think we have to figure out a way, and if we want to, we can figure out a way of how to do it and do it safely.
I just loved that. Representative Mckenzie, in Pennsylvania, what does January look like?
Yeah, so maybe because we are a full-time legislature and we've been meeting this whole time, we're possibly a little further along in the process than some others. So we already, again, mostly are meeting in person. Again, individuals can choose to vote remotely as members. But at the same time, hearings are open to the public again. Members of the public and press are able to be there. But you can just see that many are opting not to do that because hearings are now online, all online, and testifiers can be there virtually as well. A lot more people are just choosing that route. So you do just see less people in the audience at these meetings, so people can space out more appropriately, et cetera. So that's great. And, meeting virtually has also allowed for testifiers to come in from around the country who we might not have be able to come and testify before. So in that respect, it's actually opened up the dialogue and discussion a little bit. And, from a meeting standpoint, when constituents or individuals from certain groups are looking to meet with you, it's also been freeing for us to be able to do Zoom calls or virtual calls like this. Because, for instance, I had a meeting this morning with a Chamber of Commerce. It would have taken me an hour to drive there, an hour to drive back to do that breakfast meeting. At the same time, they had a great system set up where we could have an open discussion. You could have small group dialogues as well. And at the same time, it cut out 2 hours of travel time from my schedule that I was then freed up to do other meetings with other individuals. So, I think you're going to start to see, again, this hybrid model adopted going forward in the legislative process as well, which I think is a great thing. At the same time, I think some others have mentioned it, there is no replacement for in-person meetings. And so I think as much as possible, people do want to get back to that. That's just going to be dependent upon the virus and when you can actually do those things, because so much of our legislative work, as was mentioned, I think by Senator Kitchen, occurs just in the casual conversations before or after a hearing, or in the hallway, or you bump into somebody and something comes to mind that you'd been meaning to talk to them about. So all of those casual, informal interactions do play a large part in the legislative process, and there's just no replicating that virtually. So, again, I think there are some benefits that I think are going to be borne out in the coming years, but at the same time, as much as possible, getting back to the in-person meeting, I think is going to be beneficial for legislating in Pennsylvania.
We may become more efficient in our meetings so that we save commute times. I know Senator Flores, being from the Miami area, didn't want to get caught in traffic. There was some expediency to the type of meetings you're talking about, Representative Mckenzie, but there is no replacing the sausage making that happens in person. So we've got a couple more minutes before we sign off. In terms of those policy trends, things that will be on your docket come January in the spring, things that will be forever changed in the public policy world. Senator Kitchen, what do you see in terms of, I know you're a small business owner, you've got considerations coming from that angle, but what do you see as long-term changes policy-wise?
I think COVID taught us one thing, which is the more resilient and prepared for the unexpected, the better off we can all be. So it's hard to say exactly what to anticipate with regard to future legislation, but no doubt with regard to our current economic situation and the status of the federal government, and we're going to be talking about COVID-19 for many, many years to come. With regard to small business, we want to make sure that we can preserve as many businesses as possible. So obviously through the CARES Act and the federal dollars that have come to our state, we have really focused on trying to provide a steady, a stabilizing force for a lot of these independently operated businesses, all kinds of rental relief programs. We rolled out a sort of a buy one, get one sort of approach to incentivize additional spending, because so much of our state budget is dependent on sales taxes. So, we're just trying to make sure that people and businesses in particular are as stable as possible. And that we can keep our historically low unemployment rate as low as possible. We're at about 5.1% right now, if I'm not mistaken, which is pretty decent for, all things considered. But there's a lot that we need to do, and I'm anxious to get going on some of these policy measures. As a business owner and somebody who's involved deeply in the hospitality industry, making sure that we can accept people from outside of the state of Utah, even internationally. We want them to come here and spend their resources, of course. So all kinds of legislation pertaining to hospitality and entertainment is going to be really important. But I'm sad to say that I do expect to see more and more businesses shut their doors permanently, as much as I hate to say it. People are, businesses are struggling in the state, and I fear for, what the next couple months are going to look like. So, yeah, it's hard to say, but as we move forward, making sure that we can keep people stable is our key.
Yeah. Representative Mckenzie, I know you're a workforce guru. How will the workforce forever change?
Yeah, so I think the nature of work for people really depends on what type of job you have. And what I mean by that is, you hear from some individuals who are in maybe an information economy type job or a white collar job, the benefits. We've talked about the reduction in commute and being able to work from home, being able to be with your family more. These are all benefits for some individual workers, but we also have to realize that COVID-19 is having a different impact on lots of different people as well. And so frontline workers, teachers, healthcare professionals, people in food service industries, they're having a very different experience. And so we have to be really cognizant of that. And when we're looking at the nature of work, I think we have to realize all those different facets that are going on out there, how it impacts them, and how we want to change and adjust work and work environments for those people. So that's something that I think is going to be discussed. You're certainly starting to hear these discussions around liability coverage and around who can collect unemployment comp, excuses for voting, et cetera. So you can see how that impact from COVID-19 is playing out and is going to start playing out in workforce environments as well. And so I think the future of work is changing. It's been shifting. The trend is going to continue. And I think COVID-19 is going to really have an impact on that. So that's going to be a hot topic, I think, for us in Pennsylvania going forward.
Yeah. Senator Flores, I know your kids are also with you today in school as you're in this conversation. What does education look like in Florida and for the world moving forward?
Well, I think one of the silver linings, or maybe not silver linings, but things that we've learned, all of us, is the importance of patience. I think we're, as professionals, people are more patient with each other, because either you have a kid at home or you know that your coworker has a kid at home. I think it teaches our kids patience, because they're having to sit there and listen and engage with the teacher in a way that's different. And our teachers, I have to say, I mean, have done just such an absolutely amazing job of how really in Florida, from one day to the next, they just figured out how to completely change the delivery system. So as I kind of take a step back from elected office and maybe watch it from the background for a little bit, I hope that we use this opportunity as a way to really innovate in education, and recognize the things that Representative Mckenzie mentioned with the workforce. There is a very real digital divide across our country, certainly across our state. We should know, all the schools should know by now which of their students have access to devices or have access to internet, and which are the ones that don't have access to those devices and internet. And I would argue that it is absolutely incumbent upon legislatures to invest in that technology. And we're always talking about more money for education, and I think that we now have the opportunity, and I think the obligation, to absolutely make sure that every child has access to a device, has access to a stable internet connection. And I can tell you that it is possible. Again, just like I said before, listen, if you want to figure out a way to do it, you can, because while not the norm across Florida, there are certain counties and certain school districts that have done an excellent job of ensuring that every student, no matter their economic background, has that device, has everything from the computer to the earphones to the internet. So they have found a way to make it work. And some other counties haven't, and we can debate as to why they have or have not. But I can tell you from personal experience and professional experience that we can figure out a way to do that, because we talk a lot about the there have been a lot of conversation the last couple of months of kind of this COVID slide of students regressing. I see there is an incredible opportunity for students to catch up, but it's incumbent upon us as the legislators and as the policymakers to give the students and the school districts the things that they need, both the hardware, the software, the digital infrastructure, because whether we like it or not, COVID-19 is the crisis of today, but there will be a crisis that will happen at some point within the next few years that will cause us to have to be remote learning again. It may be a hurricane, as we're, dealing with in Texas and Louisiana. It could be, who knows what, it could be some other, international issue. But this will happen again, and we don't want to look 3 years from now and say, oh man, we should have done it during coronavirus. And so I'm hopeful that as I kind of take a step back, that certainly in my state, that we invest heavily in that infrastructure and that hardware for our students.
So it's been a year of crises, but it started with a health one. So to your point, Representative Hernandez, how do we come out of this with better and more improved health systems for all?
Like I mentioned earlier, yes, healthcare is at the forefront as we return to our legislative session. In Texas, has not expanded Medicaid. As I mentioned, we're one of 12 states that has not. So in my opinion, we're leading dollars on the table, and also this is impacting our communities in different ways. And we have 5 million Texans without healthcare coverage. Should we expand Medicaid, 1.5 million of them would have coverage. We also have people losing their jobs, losing their jobs, from businesses that are closing, other reasons, and with that, their health care coverage that goes along with their employment. So that's a very important issue as we try to get this virus, under control and make sure that we have testing. We want to make sure that our community doesn't feel fearful or about the cost or about going to get testing, because we need to have them tested. And so those are all issues that are important to our community, important to individuals. And I hope we've got our work cut out. I hope that our next legislative session, we join the other 38 states in expanding Medicaid.
And
Thank you.
Maggie, if I can, one additional point, I think, we deal with a lot of these policy areas, healthcare, jobs in the economy, education, and state government all the time. And now we're dealing with new facets and new variables because of COVID-19. But one thing that I think has really percolated to the top here in Pennsylvania is going to be about the balance of power between the legislature and the governor. And so we have divided government here in Pennsylvania. And, there has been a lot of discussion around how much authority should be given to the governor. I think everybody agrees that at the early stages of an emergency, you do want to have fast action from an executive. But then once things play out for a longer period of time, there does need to be some balance restored to the legislative process and the governing process at the state level. And so, the example of what happened here in Pennsylvania from a practical level was immediately there was a lot of bipartisan effort, collaborative effort with the governor and the legislature around health decisions, increased funding for PPE going out, et cetera. Now that it's been playing out for a longer period of time, with all of the power, we have a strong executive here in Pennsylvania, all of the power residing at that level, business decisions about opening and closing real estate and construction. We were one of the last states in the country to allow those to go back online. Right now, we have very restrictive rules around restaurants in place, all handed down by the governor and without the input from the legislature. So I think as we move forward, there's going to be a very robust discussion around how do we restore that balance of power so that, as we've talked about, you want to have the input from the public. You want to have inputs from different stakeholders in this decision-making process. And right now, I think that's lacking here in Pennsylvania. So trying to maintain and restore that is going to be something that we're going to have to really wrestle with as we head forward.
And it will be interesting to see in early 2021 if there are more states that actually have divided government. Because right now you are in the minority of states that actually have divided political. But we believe in all three branches here at CSG, so we wish you the best in trying to navigate those waters. Senator Kitchen, I'm going to connect you with Mary Tinkler, a South Carolina County Treasurer. She has a specific question for you on tax issues that you've worked on in Utah during the special sessions, but we are out of time. As we probably imagined, we were going to try and get through a lot today. Thank you to all of you for your insights and perspectives. You are wonderful representations of the ACYPL community. Thank you to ACYPL for existing and for serving your alumni community during this time. And thank you to everyone who tuned in this afternoon for this discussion. I hope that it was helpful, whether you come from the private sector, the public sector, local, federal, or state government. It's a very rich community, and we all love the ACYPL family. So thank you for being a part of it. And to our state elected leaders, thank you for your leadership, but especially during this time. So have a great weekend, and it's been fun, and I appreciate you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you all.